Thanks. I would like first to begin by welcoming our guests from Turkey and the U.S. and elsewhere, if there are any among the audience. It's very important to have this kind of dialogues. Politicians from Turkey coming to Canada and telling us, and Canadian politicians and Canadian citizens about the problems they face in Turkey. So I welcome them, and I welcome the audience too. I should also emphasize that I'm speaking for myself, and what I say, the organizers and our guests are not responsible for whatever I say. Let me just say about foreign policy and the Kurds. I mean Canadian foreign policy and the Kurds. Those of us who have been Kurds or Armenians or Assyrians or from other peoples of the Middle East who have been active in doing something about changing the difficult conditions of their lives. Some of us have demonstrated in front of embassies. We have written letters. We have done letter campaigns with Amnesty International and others. Most of us have had a very difficult time and bad experience actually. All doors have been closed usually when you talk about the rights of an oppressed people. This primarily because the foreign policy of states, and I would say all kinds of states, but in this case we are talking about Canada and Western powers. The foreign policy of these states really doesn't take into account the destinies of oppressed peoples. If a people is a non-state people, non-state nation, like Assyrians or like the Kurds, they generally don't count, unless if there is some reason for Canadian foreign policy to take that into consideration. But usually it's not taken into consideration. Even when there is a people like the Armenians, now they have their own independent republic, the Republic of Armenia, even that has not changed the policy of the United States in relation to the Armenian genocide. The United States still does not recognize the Armenian genocide. Even when in some countries, like in France, in European countries, the Armenian genocide is recognized, then by the parliaments of these countries, by elected representatives of the people of these countries, then usually the Prime Minister or someone at the top of the executive say that they don't have the same position. They don't think that it was genocide. So the point is that the foreign policy of a state like Canada is basically determined by its economic strategic interest. Certainly economic interest brings in political interest and military interest. This doesn't mean that oppressed people should not struggle to change the foreign policy of these countries. Especially now, a change in the last 20, 30 years is the formation of Kurdish diasporas, Iranian diasporas, Afghan diasporas. People from these countries have migrated or taken refuge in these countries, and they have become citizens, and as citizens they have the responsibility of working towards changing foreign policy. Knowing that citizens generally don't have much say in foreign policy, the executive part of the government, even the parliaments don't have that much say. The executive wing of the government usually decides what to do. Look at Prime Minister Harper, what he has done to Canadian foreign policy since he has been in power, even though he has been in a minority government. He has reversed many trends in Canadian foreign policy. I mention only one thing. It was Canadian policy under the Liberal Prime Minister Trudeau in the 60s to accept American war resistors in Canada, to welcome them, to give them refuge. Prime Minister Harper is not willing to do this. We have some 200 American war resistors who don't want to go back to Iraq and engage in war crimes. They have taken refuge in Canada, but Prime Minister Harper's government has no interest in supporting them and actually is trying to get rid of them. Conditions have changed, certainly. Canada is now militarily involved in the Middle East, in Afghanistan. And even in Iraq, Canadian oil companies are interested in the oil fields of Iraqi Kurdistan. Generally, the geostrategic of the region has changed, and now we have Kurdish citizens of Canada, although they are not a big population, but actually if they intend to become active and play a role in shaping Canadian foreign policy, they can probably do a few things. And Quebec has been interested in the situation of Iraqi Kurds. For example, Quebec sovereignties advised Iraqi Kurds during negotiations on the drafting of Iraq's constitution to struggle for their rights and to learn from the example of Quebec. There are these kinds of changes in Canadian foreign policy and also in the Kurdish situation. The Iraqi Kurdish situation is one of a semi-independent state, actually. It's still not as autonomous as Quebec is, actually. But it's a de facto independent state that has the power to engage in, let's say, dealing with the oil industry and other industries in the region, and as a result have relations of significance to foreign policy of Canada or other countries. In Turkey, surely the armed struggle led by PKK has changed the political situation of the entire country, and surely the political system of the country has seen some reform. Legally, there's legal reform. The Kurds of Turkey are struggling to change their destinies through legal reform. They have had some successes, but really the situation has not changed drastically. It's basically the old system. So the Kurds of Turkey have still to struggle for the right to a native tongue education. They still don't have this right. Under the eyes of the EU, the Turkish state is using the tool of law actually to deny the Kurds the basic right to native tongue education. And I can mention many, many other areas where on the surface you see progress, but in reality there isn't much progress. To the extent that it relates to Canadian foreign policy about Turkey, the Canadian foreign policy generally has been a copy of U.S. foreign policy. Surely under Prime Minister Trudeau there were changes, there were deviations from that policy. Canadian foreign policy showed some independence, but under Prime Minister Harper, I think it's back to the old tradition of copying American policy and actually being more American than Canadian. In connection, for example, Palestine, Prime Minister Harper's policy has been total, unconditional support of Israeli policy, including the apartheid regime that Israel has imposed on the Palestinian people. Apartheid is an international crime and no one should engage in it. But right now we are all actually in one way or another, even Canadian citizens are part and parcel of it because the Canadian government supports the apartheid regime. Apartheid is an international crime and resistance to it should be international. In connection with citizen struggles to do something about changing foreign policy, I think it's possible within the present arrangement in which foreign policy is the business of the cabinet and even not the parliament. And parliament has some say in it, but eventually it's the politicians who decide what to do. I think we're trying to get rid of, let's say, this foreign policy and change it for the better means that we have a voting system that's free, and we can vote to remove this minority government and form another government that's more respectful of the wishes of Canadian citizens, including Canadian Kurds. Here's one minimum thing that we can do, but more can be done. Being in touch with politicians who care. We have one example of them here who talk to us about the situation in the region and Canadian foreign policy. Talking to politicians who care, persuading them to be more active and to make foreign policy more citizens' business, but also informing other Canadian citizens about the struggle of the Kurdish people, Assyrian people, and other peoples in the region, the Tamil people. Prime Minister Harper's policy on the war crimes that the Sri Lanka committed against the Tamil people, again, is very regrettable. In Canada, I would say Prime Minister Harper's policy was actually to support the war crimes that the Sri Lankan government committed against the Tamil people. It's only through consciousness, raising consciousness about the terrible world in which we live. Genocides continue to be perpetrated by various regimes around the world, war crimes, crimes against humanity. These are much worse than just what we usually have talked about in the past in terms of human rights. Certainly, human rights are being violated every minute, every hour, but even the rights of peoples to exist in liberty, in freedom, in safety, in dignity. These rights are being regularly violated, and without being conscious about it, without raising consciousness, without solidarity with other Canadians, with other peoples throughout the world, it would be very difficult to turn foreign policy into citizens' business. It won't. Foreign policy is monopolized by the cabinet of various governments all over the world. And moreover, we are in a difficult situation in Canada. Canadian foreign policy has been taken hostage by the United States throughout its history. There was a mention of Canadian Japanese and their internment in camps during the Second World War. This was a disaster. It was done under conditions. It's very important to pay attention to this. The position of the Canadian Army was that Canadians of Japanese origin are not a security threat. This was the word used by the Canadian Army. But politicians decided that they are a threat. So all Canadians of Japanese origin, some of them had never seen Japan. Some of them did not know a word of Japanese language. They were all rounded up, some 20,000 Canadians, put in what I call concentration camps or internment camps, and the government was going to deport them to Japan even after the war ended in 1945. It's only when Canadian citizens organized and they protested, strongly protested, that this project was put aside. So that's the way cabinets work. I think we should be, when I talk about how governments, how foreign policy is the business of the cabinet, it means that citizens should organize first, to educate themselves. There's so much knowledge about Canadian foreign policy. There's so much knowledge about what went wrong with it. If we citizens don't do this, if we don't look at the situation and raise questions and learn from this important history, then of course nothing will happen. Then Prime Minister Harper or people like him will be able to gear the foreign policy of a country like Canada, a very important country in the world, gear it towards an end which is against the interests of the Canadian people and peoples around the world. Thank you very much, and I hope we will reach a situation in which we citizens will be more actively involved in shaping foreign policy. Thanks.